Hello lovelies. So these Know Your Role videos, these are older games, so they're not really reviews, even though it's structured like a flip through and a review. It's more a kind of discussion and rumination on where particular games might fit in the history of the hobby and things that were good or bad about them. So it's a little bit more meandering than reviews. Middle-earth role-playing was my first proper role-playing game. There was Fighting Fantasy, the introductory role-playing game before that, and before that we used to play the single-player choose-your-own-adventure books, Fighting Fantasy in particular, together. I would read and another person would make the decisions and we would go through it that way, sort of monitoring each other, whether we were doing the rules properly, that sort of thing. So in a way I was proto role-playing before then the introductory role-playing game that got me started on proper role-playing and contained information not dissimilar to Dicing with Dragons, which we talked about the other day, which led me to a model shop in Basingstoke that no longer exists, and the purchase of my first proper RPG, which was Middle-earth role-playing. So I've been trying to piece together the timeline. So The Warlock of Firetop Mountain was published in 1982. I would have been 7. I think I got into the Fighting Fantasy books late 1982. There was certainly more than one book out, maybe into 1983. The Fighting Fantasy introductory role-playing game was published in 1984. This is my second copy of the MERP book. This is the second US edition from 86, but the first edition was 84, and I think the edition I had was the first edition. So yeah, I've been gaming a long time, and looking back at Middle-earth role-playing, it's remarkable that I did. Obviously I chose it because I had already read The Hobbit and read most of and listened to the BBC audio drama of The Lord of the Rings and watched the Bakshi animated Lord of the Rings movie. So to me, fantasy and Middle-earth were pretty much synonymous in a lot of ways, which is probably why I chose this as my introduction to role-playing game. It came in a box. There were little card figures. There were a couple of hex maps. There was a little introductory choose your own adventure sort of pamphlet as well. But they're really, you look at modern games and these thick tomes and the box sets that generally speaking have quite a lot of stuff in them, and this was pretty scant really. And this is the core book for Middle-earth role-playing, and it is a mere 130 or so pages, which doesn't seem like a lot when you consider the sheer amount of lore and depth and so on to The Lord of the Rings, to Middle-earth. And that reflects a very different approach, I think, where the books and so on weren't especially lore heavy. And with Middle-earth, obviously you've got The Hobbit, you've got The Lord of the Rings, you've got the Silmarillion. Even back then you had a lot of illustrated books and guides to The Lord of the Rings. There was plenty of material, so why would you need all that lore in the core book? I'm sure went the philosophy. If all the supplementary material is already available, I mean, just in the appendices to the book version of The Lord of the Rings, you had a mass of information. So to modernize this seems rather slim, and it seems to be mostly rules, and descriptions and hand holding and so on, it's rather scant. So as an introductory RPG, this was a bit of an odd choice for me, I think. There are certain things that are very familiar, like an example of play, but generally speaking, yeah, explanations are pretty scant, and things are generally only explained once, and not necessarily where you'd expect it to be. I've been looking at quite a lot of old games recently, and this organisational convention seems to have disappeared from many books. But back then, you know, every subsection and section had a little numerical reference number, which in theory would make it easier to reference. There is an index as well, but this seems to be a holdover from, I'm guessing, board games and war games rules books, and it doesn't necessarily work as well in RPGs, but it's just interesting to see that that's around a lot in older games and not so much in newer ones. Now, this was by Iron Crown Enterprises. You also had Mithril Miniatures at the time, which tended to do the Lord of the Rings minis. As I said, it came with little card figures, and they've reused the art here, but I find the line art quite striking and effective. This was Rolemaster Lite, believe it or not, given the sheer amount of charts and tables that you're going to see. Rolemaster is a notoriously clunky, chart-heavy attempt at simulationism, which is out of favour at the moment as well. I do have a copy of Rolemaster somewhere, spread across several books. Now that is a mile thick, but even more of it is its rules and complications and exceptions. Making a Rolemaster character could take a very long time. Creating a MERP character, less complicated. It's a percentile-based system, mixing that percentile-based system with ranks in skills. So at character creation, you get to tick off a certain amount of ranks. You get bonuses from your profession. As you advance in level, those profession bonuses go up, not dissimilarly to proficiency in D&D these days. And you get additional ranks to spend. Character creation statistics are generally 1 to 100. Different racial character types get different bonuses or penalties to their particular statistics. So you can end up with scores over 100, or in some cases below 0. But by and large, it's meant to be within 1 to 100. And those things all give you bonuses from plus 35 to minus 25, if memory serves. And that modifies a percentile roll. A lot of rolls are open-ended. So if you roll particularly high on your D100, you get to roll again and add on, and roll again and add on, and so on. And if you roll particularly low, it might go the other way. So even creatures, enemies that are massively powerful in statistics can still fail, and even if you're weak, you can still succeed. So that's a fairly neat way. Now, I played this for years, but never really understood the rules. So it was just kind of storytelling with vague references to kind of sort of the rules, unfortunately. And like I say, there's not a lot of background information here, because why would you need it? Everybody knows Lord of the Rings. Everybody has access to that. But this is a weird choice as a game system for Lord of the Rings, and particularly there are conventions and ideas brought across from Rolemaster that don't necessarily work. Like, everyone in this has access to magic to one degree or another. There's a whole bunch of spell lists, and if you want to devote ranks into learning spells, you can. Whereas, as we know, in Lord of the Rings itself, magic is pretty scarce and not necessarily hugely powerful. if we think about The Lord of the Rings, magic is weirdly very low level, or ancient, or not fully understood anymore in most of the setting. There aren't really magicians running around. There are monsters. There are the Astari, who are basically angels, but there isn't a lot of actual magic going around. I suppose you could argue that the necromancer, who was thought to be just a normal person fiddling with forces he didn't understand and later turned out to be Sauron, indicates that there is some sort of magic out there. There is vague references to augurs and soothsayers and so on. And, you know, there is evidence of things like the gates or subtle magics that the elves do and so on. But it was a big deal when Gandalf, one of the most powerful magical beings actually on the world, lit some fire cones. You know, that was a big deal. And he doesn't do a lot of truly ostentatious magic throughout the whole thing. He makes some light, he fights a Balrog, but not really using spells per se. That's about it. So it's a weird choice to have magic be so prevalent in MERP, and so available to anybody and everybody, really, and the spells don't necessarily fit what you would expect from the Lord of the Rings. Of course, you could always restrict magic, ignore it, not develop your character in that way, but it's still a very odd and peculiar choice. Not the worst system that Middle-earth has ever been adapted to. That probably goes to various iterations of D&D, which are manifestly unsuited for a Lord of the Rings game. But yeah, it's still a peculiar choice. Rolemaster, and hence MERP, even though it's a simplified version, yeah, it has a reputation for complexity and difficulty. But in actual fact, the system itself is relatively simple when you think about it. Open-ended D100 rolls, modified by a bonus or penalty. There's not a huge amount to that. It's just that you have to go and look things up in the various tables when it comes to doing anything like maneuvers or how much damage you do in combat. For example, let me find a table example if I can. Okay, so if you're making a one-handed slashing attack against a target in plate mail armor, you're going to have to score at least 50 to do 1 point of damage, right? And then if you roll particularly well, right, you do damage and you get a table to help determine any critical damage that you do. So if that was a sword hit, for example, where's the... I've apparently gone blind. That's fumbles. Oh well, trust me, there are critical tables for all kinds of different weapon strikes and hits, and there are different classes of criticals. You know, A, B, C, D, and E, and the higher the letter, the worse they are. And so you roll a D100 on the appropriate critical table, adding a bonus for the level of the crit. So, say you rolled a 69, nice. Scoring an E critical with a lightning bolt, so that would take it to 89, and the result would be permeated by electricity entire nervous system rearranged, drops and lies in shock for 12 rounds before dying. So yeah, I think we can attribute some of my affection for percentile systems and some of my lingering affection for simulationism, and my love of gnarly and gratuitous critical hits to my early experiences with MERP. Certainly that last is part explains at least some of my love for Blood, the horror RPG, which I published a second edition of. Creature and animal statistics are remarkably simple when you think about it, but you can the whole interaction of the systems can lead to some peculiar outcomes, like an unskilled hobbit one-shotting a Balrog, as happened in one MERP campaign, or characters just dying instantly due to bad luck. So that may or may not be something that you like or love. There's a great deal of emphasis on race and sub-race and culture in MERP, which you probably wouldn't see so much today. The trend is to move away from that sort of thing, but ancestry was always very important in Tolkien's writings, so it kind of makes sense to have it here. It's certainly not offensive, it's certainly not trying to be racist or anything. It's just, that's the background of the books, so it makes sense to do it. Yeah, so it's a weird artifact of older gaming. I think even the adventures are fairly scant, and like I say, it's only 130 pages, albeit cramped and crammed, mostly with rules, and without hand-holding. It's very sparse, it's very efficient, and like I say, I was only 9, and had a hard time understanding the rules, but we muddled through, and we did a lot of adventures with MERP, and eventually went on to other games. This was my first proper RPG, and I could have had a lot worse introductions. It's just looking back on it, the complexity of the Rolemaster system, even in simplified form, all the tables and charts and everything that you needed to reference. It's sort of anathema to modern game design in many ways. And I wonder, have we lost something by no longer really pursuing simulationism and realism and grittiness? Maybe we have. There's weird historical ways in which the game is organized, with the sub-numbering of the sections, and it doesn't contain a lot of information about the setting, which is something you would normally expect in a modern game, and which would at least double the number of pages we're talking about here. But here they assume that, it's Middle-earth, everyone knows Middle-earth, right? So it's rather scant descriptions of things, even when they're important concepts to the game. The magic is weird and out of place, but like I said, it's not the most weird and out of place system. I don't have the box anymore. I still have the old contents of the box somewhere, but they didn't really add much to the game. I've still got the original dice that I got with it, a pink and a blue D20, each numbered 0 to 9 twice. They've crumbled at the edges from overuse, which will be familiar to people with older dice in their collection, but I've still got them. I treat these kind of like reviews in some ways, so I will be giving it a score. I just don't have the rest of the box to show you. The figurines, the fold flat, put in a little stand figurines, was something that was very good, and better art than you see in much of the book. The print process was not kind to the more complex artwork presented here, though the pieces on the cover and so on are classic and should be familiar to people from back in the day. This being, well before the films, of course. So if I were to give it a score, despite my fondness and nostalgia for MERP, style-wise, it's Middle-earth, but Middle-earth is not particularly present in the book. So judging the book separate from the setting, because the book doesn't particularly contain the setting, is difficult. You've also got to keep in mind the time, the print quality and effectiveness available at the time. Certainly many of the illustrations are striking and visual in a way that a lot of modern RPG art isn't, but it does suffer from the modern problem of muddy art when it comes to the slightly more complex and shaded illustrations. A middling 3 for style, I think. At the time, it was maybe a cut above a lot of stuff that was being presented, and the box set did feel like it was fairly complete and the figurines were good. So average to slightly above average, like I say, kind of middling. So maybe what would be a 3.5 out of 5 for style. In terms of substance, I mean, as a game book, it's lacking, but that reflects the design philosophy of the time in a lot of ways. Settings were more kind of implicit or would be brought out in supplementary material, and that was certainly the case with MERP, which had some of the best supplementary material on the market at the time. The adventures and the setting books and so on, which were separate, bit of a cash grab maybe, but they were very good. So substance, I mean, we're talking 2.5. So that gives us an overall score of 3.5 plus 2.5 out of 5. So that's 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 out of 10. 3 out of 5. Distinctly average to a modern viewpoint, but for someone who was steeped in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit at the time, massively enthusiastic about them, devouring everything I could watch or hear about them, having access to the books and art books and so on, the game didn't need to be that much better or more fulsome than we got. I can see, looking back, the long reach of the effect that the MERP had on my role-playing career and interests, and even my professional career, developing and writing, RPG material. It certainly set the tone for the rest, and I am grateful and glad that I didn't start with Dungeons and Dragons, that I started with fighting fantasy, with MERP, slightly later, Dragon Warriors, Twilight 2000, that my role-playing education and induction was much broader and diverse, and to my mind more interesting than just Dungeons and Dragons, which is unfortunately how a lot of people get into the hobby. I hope that was somewhat interesting for you, even if it's really just an excuse for me to meander and be nostalgic and point out the oddities. Other versions of Middle-earth role-playing games are available from your retailers and resellers. Zang. Postmortem Studios, role-playing games, and a lot more to die for. Post-mort.com